Okay, good morning everyone. How are you? How is everything? Today I am also in school, so we're going to have our session from school because we're reading the exams and everything else. Before we start, I just want you to know that please make sure you always check the course Novia. By tomorrow maximum, I will put homeworks and assignments you to do. You already have one. I put in the winter vacation, okay? So if you didn't see it, please do. Please do the homework. It's one assignment, okay? So I'm going to put more that you need to do for by the end of this week, which is by Saturday, okay? So make sure from now on that you go on the PowerPoint presentation, you look at what we discussed in sessions, and for sure, I will put the homeworks and assignments from what we discussed. Okay, so nothing new. Anyways, the topics that we're discussing right now, we discussed before the winter break, but we didn't have time to have it on the exam. So, so in that sense, you know, you're on the right track, so don't worry. It's everything that we discussed so far, nothing new. However, I want you to review, like we talked from the beginning of the year, make time for yourself so you're not overstressed. Because if you're overstressed, then it will be an issue, right? So as long as you review at least half an hour every week, you know, half an hour, 15 minutes, in the sense of 15 minutes, maybe twice per week, 3 times per week, it makes such a big difference, right? You just review what we talked about, okay? It'll be in your head, you'll know how to answer right away, the quizzes, the projects, and everything else, okay? And if you have any questions, you would ask in the sessions or inputs up or in the private message. Okay, so let's right now start with the video that we talked about last time. Okay, for everyone, I want you to open up the camera. I want to see you. Yes, and if you have any questions, ask me. Are there any questions so far? Any questions in mind? Okay, so right now we're going to start. I want you to look at the definition of foreign policy. Does anyone remember what is the one part of definition that we talked about of foreign policy? It's a whole big definition, right? There are different characteristics in it, but what's one part that we talked about last time? Does anyone remember? Anyone? Ahmad Tariq, Ahmad Mu'taz, Malik al-Shafi, Mazen, Ibn Qamzan, everyone? Okay, we talked about the part of that the relationships between the government and other governments, right? We also talked about that there are different policies, conflicts, peace policies like environment, like for example, maybe social problems, solutions for social problems like overpopulation, or like for example, you have education, you have you know the issues of, you know, as like for example gender issues, as for example employment, right, to always have employment in the country, and also relationships with other countries, with other organizations like the United Nations, right, with the world. Okay, so this is really important too. Okay, great. So let us right now, I'm going to share the video. I want you to look at the video. Okay, let's share it. Okay, so we said about diplomacy, right? Diplomacy is really important. Okay, diplomacy is basically the etiquette and also the formality between different governments and how they interact together and how the different governments interact with the organizations, with all international aspects, businesses, economies, environment, everything that has to do with international level. Okay, and big corporations. So that's diplomacy, right? Usually there's a kind of etiquette for diplomacy. Okay, so usually you have to study in a college and you have to graduate and go and get trained and go in you know, the whole world of diplomacy. Okay. Okay, so that's for diplomacy. What about military and security policy? What do you think foreign policy has to do with it? Military and security policy. Yes, Azzuddin, I can't hear you very well. Can you open up the,
Yes,
yes.
yes, Miss Mai, how are you?
I'm fine. How are you? How is everything? Sorry, one second. Okay, was it you that was trying to say the comment or someone else?
Sorry,
Are you the one
can you repeat the
who,
question?
are you the one who for a while tried to say a comment or another person?
Call you?
Yes. Okay, so
Call you, Miss, I can't hear you.
you can't hear me? Okay, can you
No,
hear
I
me
didn't.
now? One second. Can everyone hear
I
me?
didn't.
Yes. Okay. Is everyone on the right track? I want you to tell me if you can hear me. Can you hear me? Yes, everyone?
Yes, now I can hear you.
Okay, excellent job. Okay. So right now,
Okay, what was the
military,
question again?
yes, military and security policy. How is it related to foreign policy? Here, the military and security policy. How is it related to foreign policy? That's the question. Yes, can anyone tell me before we start? Okay. Okay, it's related in the sense of, for example, the foreign policy sector, right? Or the government part, or the administration, or you can say the branch in the government of foreign policy. It deals with, at a time of war, the rules, right? It makes it kind of has its own has its own debate or dialogue, or not necessarily, it's more of dialogue, right? It's dialogue, communication with other governments, with even the country that is doing war on, right, or having war with, right? Okay, so that's very important, right? So it goes to United Nations. The foreign policy part of the government is where it goes to United Nations and talks to the world about if it does a war, if no, on the contrary, it has a war, another country did a war on it, okay? If it's under the legislation of the international law, okay? Like, for example, happened in the Iraqi war, right? So when the US and other countries, also the US, wanted to have a war in Iraq, they had to go to the UN. Which part of these governments went? The foreign policy part. Okay, so that part is where it goes to the UN, right? In today's world, for example, with the Syrian issue and other issues that's happening in the world, that also part goes to the UN, the foreign policy part. Okay, so one second. Let me just admit. Yes. Okay. So for the newcomers, we are talking about foreign policy, and right now about the military and security policy. Okay, military obviously also has to do with convincing the president or the government or the prime minister, basically the person or the political group or the part of the government that has the power to decide if there's war or not. So that's also another kind of, you know, another kind of characteristic of the foreign policy sector of the government, okay? So it does its research, it goes around, it actually goes around to different governments, it sees if they have allies, if they have the money for the military, for the ammunition, or opposite, if no, they think it's not right for human rights laws, for different, different kind of perspectives. So this is the foreign policy, okay? It advises the decision maker, and the decision maker in the end makes the decision. Sometimes the foreign policy does have that power, but not always. Usually, mostly, the foreign policy is the advisor. It does not have the power of saying war or peace, right? It's more the president or the authoritative power in the government, which is maybe the president, the political party, the queen, the king, or the parliament, right? The prime minister. So it differs from country to country. Okay. And security policies. What does security policy mean? Does anyone know? Does anyone know what security policy means? This is very important for foreign policy. When we talk about security policy, what does it mean?
It's what the Security Council is based and built on. It's like about my how I deal with other countries when it comes to wars. Like, for example, if this country and this country are in war,
Yes.
am I new?
Excellent. Okay, I can't hear very well. It's fine. Good job, Azadeen. Okay, you get extra credit for today for great participation. Everyone else, I want you to tell me how security policy. Azadeen said a very good point. When you have two countries on war and they're neighboring or they're near you in the region, you would have to make sure, as a person of foreign policy, with your colleagues or the other people around you in foreign policy that are in the same workforce or in the same branch or in the same place, you make sure that the government and the country are taking the policies and the steps needed to be secure, right? Either you do it through going to the UN or through going to other countries, taking, researching, maybe seeing what are the actions we need to take as a country so that the country is secured from these conflicts. Not only conflict, you can also have security policy. For example, if you have drug trafficking, right? If you have, for example, maybe there is huge pollution problems in other neighboring countries or in the world. Security policy, security for, the pollution, right? Obviously, some pollutions causes a lot of cancerous diseases cause a lot of diseases, other diseases that are really bad. So we need to make a security policy against pollution. Sometimes it's very bad. Other times, security policy is for natural disasters, not only for war or for environment in the sense of pollution, also natural disasters. So we need to make kind of research, and this is where the foreign policy comes from. Number one is that they do it with obviously other governments and countries, organizations that are, that have experience, that have the research, that have the background information, and that advise and can help the foreign policy to see what can we do, right? Okay, so what can we do with the problem of, for example, we always have earthquakes. Okay, we need to talk to other governments from other countries in the region. Why do we have the earthquakes? We need to talk to the UN. We need to talk to different geographical, right? Institutions that deal with tectonics, that deal with geography. Okay, geography of the country. So inside or outside. This is all outside of the government. So obviously the foreign policy does it. Okay, if there's dialogue, if there's kind of convincing the decision makers who give the funding, who give the okay, like we say, or like we say in today's world, the acceptance, the formal acceptance of going and, for the foreign policy to preserve the land, to preserve it in all these aspects. Do you see how complicated it is? Sometimes it takes many years. Sometimes, no, it takes, maybe 2 days. It depends on the country and how powerful the foreign policy sector is. Some countries are not powerful, actually. It's very weak. Others know it's very powerful. And as we said, usually it's very strong in time of war and peace or in time of crisis, because communication with others, other governments and organizations is a need, okay? And that's the main characteristic of foreign policy, right? Not only that, you find that all of these, and even more we're going to talk about, is in the foreign policy branch of the government. The other governments are more of, legislation, judicial, it's more of internal and external policies of the country in general to the country. Our foreign policy is the only branch that the government can be active outside of itself, outside of the country, to the different organizations or governments, or obviously international businesses or anything else that they are in need of, and opposite, they are also in need of. So it's a kind of communication and also advice, communication, and with these issues: diplomacy, military and security policy. The next one is international human rights. Okay, so international human rights is very important. The international human rights policies. Some countries in their foreign policy, they concentrate on the fact that you know, we need to develop as a country. We need to be active in human rights in the world. Okay, so they have that as an objective. Others no, they are, you know, they want to be under maybe a certain kind of human right policy because they have problems. Okay, that's different. So a country you have which is highly developed, or maybe, you know, is interested as an objective for different reasons to go by certain human rights policies. Other countries no. Other countries it's more like, you know, we do have these problems. We need to abide by these rules because it's obviously better for our country and for development, obviously for the world. Okay. Other countries, they are obliged, right? Like for example, the United Nations, it forces in international all the laws. If you are not under a certain law, then you would have certain restrictions. Okay. Now, does it force in the sense of it obliges from the beginning? If you're not part of this law, then no, it depends. Okay, it depends. That sometimes it's like that, sometimes no, but usually it doesn't force. But if you're not under it, then you don't get certain incentives or certain, you know, kind of, you know, the positive side of it, obviously, if you are. Okay. However, if you are and if you don't abide by it, then that's the big, you know, that's the big issue, right? So if you are still not and you're not abided by it, then that's different. Okay, so you're not really forced, right? Because sometimes countries, you know, from the perspective of their own country, they have their own human rights activists, they have their own agenda, right? But also usually, if you abide by the international human rights in the UN or in other international organizations, you have to abide by it. You can't go against it. If you do, then you have restrictions, and you are, you know, you're abided to be punished, or, you know, to have certain kind of punishment, or certain kind of, you know, restrictions on everything, because you cannot go against it. Okay, so this is very important. Who deals with all these issues? The foreign policy. Okay, for every country. So who's the one who researches, who gets the communication, who gets the positive, you know, maybe the positive applause from the organizations that actually is developing greatly the country, or opposite, the punishment or restrictions because maybe it's not abiding by the law and it should. Okay, the foreign policy. Do you see how important it is? So this branch is who deals with all these issues. Okay, any questions so far? Is it clear? Yes? Okay, we're going to move on to economic policy, environmental policy. We said from the beginning that economic policies include, for example, employment to increase effectively, right, in the country and also developing in the world. Economic policies as, for example, the economy of the country or the world is increasing in a positive way, okay? The environmental policy is like what? What did we say about environmental policy? This is right now a big issue in the world, right? Environmental policy. There are activists, there are different people in the world, parties, organizations that really care about the environment. Give me an example of environmental policy, or what it is.
My environmental policy.
Sorry, 1 second. Let's go back. So, what's the example of an environmental policy? Okay, like for example, in Egypt, you know, you have the recycling world in Egypt where there are different factories that recycle, right? That's part of it in the sense of obviously that need acceptance from the government, and also it's highly regarded in international terms and in development terms. This is the foreign policy. Okay, maybe it makes sure that the organizations of the world, they know that there is such a thing, which is good for international relations and for the good of the country. It develops more, it can get funding, it can get a kind of support from the world, from organizations that there is recycling. Funding, and also not only funding, it can give them training, ideas, and everything else. Also for environmental policy, obviously, is pollution, right? If you have pollution in the country, then there's a problem. Okay, so the foreign policy makes sure that the research and everything reflects what the level of pollution there is, so that it can go to different organizations and governments that like to develop and help in this area, either through its private or through its public sector, or through like the UN or other ones, through its different branches that deals with pollution. Okay, so who's the one who communicates, who's the one who does the research, who's the one who advises for different reasons, who makes the final, doesn't make the final decision, but we said advises for the people who make the final decision in the country and elsewhere, is the foreign policy. Okay, so I'll give you an example. For example, today, for some reason, in next year, maybe there's a high rate of pollution in Egypt. So what happens is that the foreign policy makes sure the research is done so that it can get funding from the UN, so that it can have a program to decrease the pollution level. Okay, so when it has that, what happens? What happens is that they may make like a 5-year program of of the objective of decreasing the pollution. Okay, so when they do that, and when they put it when it's decided upon from the president or from whoever is the one who has the power of decision making for that program, then it's inactive. So it starts the program, the 5-year program. Okay, and obviously the foreign policy is the one that goes year by year to see if it does develop, if there are any problems from the policy, any positive side, any negative side, any kind of dialogue it needs to do with other governments. Maybe the policy is starting to infringe on the security of neighboring countries in Egypt for some reason. Maybe not opposite, it's actually developing and creating a kind of positive relationship with other countries. So this is the foreign policy deals with. Okay? So any questions on that? Okay, I want you to look at right now this definition, okay, that we talked about, and to think about the 5 different sides of foreign policy: diplomacy, military and security policy, international human rights policies, economic policies, and environmental policy.
International human rights policies, economic policies such as trade and international energy policy, and environmental policy. My environmental policy is that. In some ways, foreign policy is the quintessential public good. Everybody benefits from a policy that makes citizens in the world safer, and no individual, except for maybe a Bond-style supervillain, could pull it off by themselves. Like all government policy, foreign policy has goals. Of course, foreign policy is about providing security, but American foreign policy also seeks to create prosperity and works toward the somewhat idealistic goal of making the world a better place. Security has many facets, and like most things, it has grown more complex over time. It used to simply mean being able to repel invaders. No, not the Mongols, more like the British. Now, however, in addition to physical security, foreign policy encompasses transportation, energy, cybersecurity, and food security. So we can see how foreign policy and economic policy are closely related. And of course, we can't forget terrorism. Can't resist a little history here, especially since this is the last episode of the series. From the beginning, starting with George Washington, in terms of physical security, the U.S. has been pretty isolationist, although Canadians and Mexicans would probably disagree. George Washington urged the U.S. to avoid foreign entanglements, and we basically did right up until World Wars I and II, when threats to the international order were seen as detrimental to American security, even though there wasn't much danger of the Germans invading the U.S. After World War II, the advent of long-range bombers and then ICBMs meant that there was a threat to Americans in America, and security policy developed into one of deterrence, which meant building up enough military strength to discourage potential enemies, pronounced Soviet Union, from attacking us. Deterrence was expensive and required a large arsenal of dangerous weapons and a willingness to fight, which the U.S. did in Korea and Vietnam. We still maintain an enormous nuclear arsenal, but nowadays, different security threats mean deterrence is less important. It's not clear that
Okay, here you have about security threats for every country. Okay, he's talking here about the United States. So the United States had, from World War I, World War II, an interest to always have peace in the world because it was in threat. Okay, especially that the US in its geography was always independent, so it was always far away. The same thing with Canada and other countries in North America and South America, but mainly the US, it was far away from the other countries that had conflict, like in Europe or in Africa. Europe, Africa, and Asia, they're close together. But you'll find that there's a big ocean that separates this huge region with North America and South America, where the US is Canada, Mexico, and the other countries. So they were kind of different, especially the US. The US was very strong because it had no kind of, threat to its security. But then the world wars, what happened? There happened the invention of airplanes, the invention of big boats and ships, and even more. So that means that the oceans will not be, not only for North America, South America, but for other regions, it will not be a kind of defense, right? So obviously, the US and other countries that had this benefit right away thought about the opportunity of making peace and the opportunity of always making sure that different governments and countries in the world, they don't go to war, or they're not, very vicious, very, as it was in the Nazi Party in Germany or other countries. They don't aggress on other countries, and they don't make war, and you don't have terrorism, or any kind of, political parties, armies that can go and aggress on any other country like that. Okay, there should be a kind of international relation etiquette. There should be a kind of system back then, and that's why they made, like, for example, League of Nations or the United Nations. That was the idea, because the invention of airplanes, the war, how it changed, made everyone in the world in threat. So that's why the US and other countries in the world really focused on the issue of, what's it called? The issue of making sure that the country is always secure. And there is a kind of program or a kind of way of going by to make a war. You can't just the next day, say war. That's wrong. Okay, that was the objective of the United Nations after World War II, because that was the problem with World War I, World War II. You just have, maybe after a month or two, or just a country, you wake up in the morning, you find the country, you find the army in your country, and the war starts. That was not acceptable after United Nations was created. Even the countries that did do that, they had a lot of issues with human rights with different laws in the world. Because obviously, as you know, the ammunition, the security is always, is always in threat because of the constant development, unfortunately, of weapons and armies and everything that has to do with war. Okay? So obviously, security policy is very important for the foreign policy sector in every government, right? And it's very important for it to be always with the United Nations and with other governments and international organizations that abide with the law and with the human rights policies in that section, okay, and in that world. Any questions on that? Yes? Okay, great.
Gigantic nuclear threat has much effect on terrorists, and since 2001, America has pursued a global war on terror that, as we saw in Iraq, includes the doctrine of preemptive war to forestall potential threats. Although military force may be the most visible form of U.S. foreign policy, it might not be the most useful. For one thing, it's generally seen as a last resort, which I'd say is a good thing. It also has significant downsides, including costs, both in terms of lives and money. It's also politically dangerous because while Americans are usually on board with short, decisive, and victorious military actions, the longer a war drags on, the less support it tends to have. The main economic goals of foreign policy are to expand opportunities for the U.S., promote foreign investment, maintain access to foreign energy supplies, and promote trade policies that will keep prices low at American big box stores. What this means in practice is that the U.S. maintains an active role in international organizations like the World Trade Organization, make and uphold free trade rules. We grant most favorable nation status to trading partners that agree to low tariffs, and most notably we engage in regional trade agreements like NAFTA. The third goal of foreign policy is to make the world a better place. One way that the U.S. does this is through international human rights initiatives. The U.S. is a party to many human rights treaties, but we have a somewhat complicated relationship.
Okay, this is a really good point for the U.S. and other countries to know. Foreign policy, what its role does with developing other nations or developing in different social problems, like, for example, pollution, overpopulation, family problems, world insecurity like terrorism, for example, or for example, if there's a war, you want to kind of do peace between them. If there is a kind of, natural disaster issue, like what happened in Indonesia with the tsunami and other places also, big earthquakes, like in Iran or in Mexico or in Japan, you want to develop it, okay, in the sense of you want to help out in that catastrophe. And so this is what's important. What does the country do? Usually it abides by human rights treaties, and it has different kinds of relationships that are very complicated between governments, between lawmakers, between international human rights, between everything that you can think about with this problem, and it always prospers, develops in this real. Okay, this is what's important, right? So they have to abide under human rights treaties. They have to abide under certain programs. It's not just like that. Okay. So obviously the positive part is that it's developing the world and it's in this system, and obviously it comes positively on the country because it's active in the world of human rights and active in the world of different organizations and development. Okay, what do you think will the country gain if it's like that? If it goes into a program developing the world, what would it gain through its foreign policy? What do you think it would gain? Okay, maybe it would gain that. Obviously, it has an idea and it knows what's going on in that world, right? Like maybe in natural disasters, it knows why it's happening, the different research. When it helps out, it not only knows, but it makes its population aware of it, so that it by itself, it has the same problem, it can overcome it, and it has other countries that obviously would help it out. Okay, not only that, it would be excellent for it as a government to have excellent relationship with that country, right? The country in the end will have good alliance with it, will have good relations maybe in its positive side in economic, maybe economic sector, public sector, whatever sector it has, right? So in the end, it would come back on it in a positive way. Okay, so this is important. Like for example, in China, it may be countries that always supported it in its overpopulation problem. It comes back to it in a positive way in the sense of maybe it's an economy, its products, maybe other things that it has, its culture, its heritage, right? So this is, one of the many things that the country would gain. Okay, so obviously any country that has a good initiative and develops other, other countries or, other programs in the world, not only one country, maybe it's a program, maybe it's literacy program, okay, technology program, economic development program. As well, usually through foreign policy, the country gives its experience, its research, especially if it has the capacity, right? Some countries, it may not have the capacity, but it has the initiative. Others know they do have the capacity, okay? And so obviously it goes back positive on it. It gains a lot in culture and heritage, in alliance, and also in excellent kind of relationship, right? Positive. Okay. Okay. So we're talking about development in the world.
With the UN, an international lawmaking body, so we don't sign on to all of them. For example, the U.S. hasn't signed on to the International Criminal Court, probably because we're afraid that submitting to its jurisdiction would be a loss of our sovereignty. But in reality, international law isn't a huge part of American foreign policy. The U.S. also engages in international peacekeeping missions, and international peace certainly makes the world a better place. America doesn't usually commit its soldiers to UN peacekeeping missions, preferring to make its own coalitions or work through NATO, which, by the way, is an example of international security agreement, too. See, there's a lot of overlap here. Another way the U.S. makes the world a better place is through international environmental policy. Again, that's my environmental policy.
Okay. Right now, we're talking about a very important point here. He's talking about the US, that some laws, some international laws, as for example, criminal, judicial, or environment, or economy, there are treaties, right? the UN usually has a certain treaty that all countries should sign. Okay, now obviously the UN, some, I think they force, others no, it's voluntary. Okay, however, also there's another side to it where why do you think the government would not sign the treaty? Okay, like the US or other governments and countries. Or like for example in Egypt or other countries. So obviously all countries have some treaties that they sign and some treaties that they don't sign, right? And they have their own reasons. One reason, as you said, is for the sovereignty of the state. The government and the state believes that if I sign a treaty, it would infringe on my privacy or infringe on me as a state. I value some certain, privacy or certain laws in my country I can't sign. Okay, in that sense, obviously the UN or any other international organizations cannot force the country, okay, because it has a certain reason, right? This is very important, maybe cultural reason, maybe privacy, maybe infringement on security, maybe any other reason. So this is really important from the perspective of the country, of the foreign policy, right, office, and also of the organization itself, like the UN. Okay, obviously the UN does its own research and knows that some countries they can't, or it's offensive or opposite, it would make it weak, or they see it's not very productive for it as a country, or it would, instead of develop it, it would, on the opposite, cause many problems. Okay, this is really important. Who sees all this? The Foreign Policy Office. Okay, so the Foreign Policy Office either does research and tells the president or the prime minister or the parliament or the monarchy or whoever is in charge, we believe that this treaty is effective for us. We believe opposite. This treaty actually is not. Okay, so you'll find that all countries, some sign treaties, some others don't. Any questions on that? Okay, so before we end the session, it will end soon. I just want you to know that you have one homework assignment, okay, on Corso Novia. So make sure you do it. I'm going to add other homework assignments that you need to do by Saturday this week. Okay, so make sure you look at the PowerPoint presentation. Make sure you look at the video. This is the same video on the Corso Novia. In the coming sessions, we'll discuss more and more on foreign policy. I want you, in your own time, to give around 15 minutes, right? 3 times per week to review, or 2 times, okay? 15 to half an hour. Like that, when we have the quiz, when you have the homework assignments, it won't take much time, okay? You'll have in your head, you have a good base. In the sessions, you can discuss and answer questions, and not only that, if you get extra credit, if you have your own perspective and you share with the class, that would be great. Some of you guys did, excellent job, keep it up. The other ones, I want you to, okay? And please make sure that you're always on task with the new announcements and everything else, okay? Any questions? Yes? Thank you everyone who turned in their winter packet and their missing assignments and homework. Soon it will be in the system when we put the grades of the exams and everything else for your final grade. I did get some of you guys turned in last night, great, and before the winter I got them all either on the WhatsApp or Corso Novia, okay? Obviously, if the assignments and homework, please turn it in Corso Novia. If you have any problems, tell me, and we'll see. Either you send to me through email or WhatsApp, but Corso Novia is number 1. Okay, so you need to submit it on Corso Novia or at least have a hard copy. Yes? So even if you submit it to me through email or WhatsApp afterwards, I want a hard copy, so it's reference for you. Okay, so right now, I just want to do a quick review, and the session will cut soon.